This is Asian Insider, and I'm Nirmal Ghosh. Today we look at the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China, marked on October 1 by a massive parade in Beijing with a huge military component and a vow by President for Life, Xi Jinping, that nothing is going to stop China.
No force can shake the status of our great motherland or stop the Chinese people and nation from marching forward.
So joining me on Skype today are the Straits Times Beijing Bureau Chief Tan Don-wei, Beijing correspondent Danson Chong, and in Singapore, the Straits Times Associate Editor Vikram Khanna. Dawn and Danson, hi. You were at the parade. What are your impressions? What stood out?
Well, if I can start, it was pomp and pageantry with Chinese characteristics. What struck me was, in fact, the brevity of Mr. Xi's speech. It was only 8 minutes long, and he had repeated some of the points which he made just the night before at a banquet. Reunification with Taiwan, a promise to stick to the one country, two systems model, and that China will continue on its path of national rejuvenation. So even though the speech itself, at the parade was very short, I think the message was very clear that, these were the points that he wanted to make. Although it was a little, you kind of expected that he might have used the occasion because, it's the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And China is going through some difficult times. It's facing a multitude of challenges, not least of which the economic slowdown and this intense rivalry with the United States. So I suppose we had expected him to maybe stoke nationalism a little bit more, sort of rally the troops, as it were, and to project that strength and that power a bit more. But then, even though, like I said, even though the speech was short, I think the message was very clear that, no one is going to stand in the way of China's continued rise.
Okay, very interesting. It took a long time, this parade. Now, is this China's defining moment? It's the 70th anniversary. But how much of it is Xi Jinping's defining moment?
Well, in terms of the military, I think, it was under Xi that, in 2015, China began sort of sweeping reforms in the military, that included massive reorganization of the PLA. The whole intention of it, is to turn the PLA into a sort of leaner and modern fighting force. Strong armed forces is a key part of, Xi's Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. So, and yesterday, we saw a lot of these things on display. We saw China's invested massively in R&D. We saw new ballistic missiles, new tanks, new drones. A lot of spectators, who were there, told me, it was a very, very stirring sight, to see all these things, see the PLA, march down in force down Chang'an Avenue while you're surrounded by all these symbols of national power. And I think a large part of the nationalist fervor is because of Xi Jinping. To quote you an example, so security is very tight, and almost every row had like a security guard. And the guard that was assigned to my row, he was supposed to act stern and gruff, but every time there was a song that came on, you would see him try to keep himself from smiling, and at the same time he was mouthing the words. So it was very, very stern. I think a lot of this is due to Xi Jinping's efforts.
Vikram, I'd like to bring you in here. One of the key elements of China's global power now, or global reach, has been, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. Americans and some others call it coercive capitalism. India has stayed away. There has been a bit of a backlash, and more recently, China has to some degree acknowledged this criticism. Can you tell us a little bit about this, and whether China has made any adjustments in the way it is reaching around the world with its loans and so forth?
Right. Now, the BRI was launched in 2013. It's Xi Jinping's signature initiative. It's a massive initiative spanning 70 countries, under which China builds infrastructure, roads, railways, ports, power stations, and so on, across Asia, large parts of Central and Eastern Europe, Africa, all the way to actually Western Europe, including Italy. So on paper, it's a masterstroke. It's a very bold initiative. China gets to build all this infrastructure, which fills many gaps. Other people are not building this stuff. China gets to export its excess capacity. China builds new trade routes for the future. So it sounds like win-win all around, and countries get this spanking new infrastructure. But in practice, it's run into all kinds of headwinds, as you suggested. I mean, one thing is that projects are just rushed through without proper due diligence. I mean, look at Malaysia's East Coast Rail Link. There was no proper bidding process. The project was basically handed on a platter to the China Communications Construction Company. Or the Jakarta-Bandung Rail, the high-speed rail, where they didn't do any land acquisition study beforehand, and so the whole thing got delayed. Another problem is that there's massive cost overruns. I mean, these incredibly costly projects. Malaysia's project had to be scaled down from 66 billion ringgit to 44 billion ringgit. The deepwater port in Myanmar had to be scaled down as well by even larger amount. And then a lot of them are not commercially viable. I mean, you have, for example, this project that goes from Suzhou all the way to Warsaw in Poland across the Gobi Desert. It doesn't make commercial sense. Now, these things have to be subsidized, so there are all kinds of problems, and then a lot of them don't have the buy-in of the local public because they're basically bilateral projects between Chinese entities and the political leadership, right? So there's been a lot of pushback on for these reasons.
It's interesting because I recently wrote a piece based on a Pew Research survey, which was released just a couple of days ago, actually.
Yeah.
And I have the notes here. This was on attitudes towards China globally. And of course, in the US and Canada, it's turned quite negative. And that's not surprising because it's been negative for quite some time in the US ever since the US-China trade war started and China was officially identified as a strategic competitor. So in much of the West, much of Western Europe, it is negative. In the US and Canada, it is negative. If you get to the Asia Pacific, and this is interesting, they surveyed 5 countries in the Asia Pacific. It was Japan, South Korea, Australia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Japan had an 85% unfavorable rating. South Korea was at 63% unfavorable, Australia 57%, the Philippines at 54%, and Indonesia, interestingly, China's favorability rating collapsed from 73% in 2002 to 36% in 2019, this year. So that is quite interesting. It sort of reflects the public, the propaganda and that some of the governments are putting out. Certainly in the States, there's a bit of rising xenophobia in the States. So may I ask all of you for 30 seconds each, your brief thoughts. Dawn, starting with you. Can President Xi Jinping, I mean, he spoke about upholding one country, two systems. What does that mean for Hong Kong?
Well, I think for Mr. Xi to say it twice, once at the banquet on Monday night, and then again just before the parade on Tuesday, that he's pledging to uphold the one country, two systems model for Hong Kong and Macau is significant because up until this point he hasn't really publicly discussed Hong Kong at all. So there have been some worries that China was going to wait until the October 1st celebrations were over before they take any sort of action or even intervene. But it does look right now that is not going to happen. And it looks like China is still going to continue to let Hong Kong take care of its own affairs unless something very dramatic or drastic happens. But of course, it can still pull the strings from behind the scenes.
Yes, absolutely. Danson, let's get to Taiwan for a moment. Can you tell me very briefly, will President Xi Jinping and China be able to get Taiwan on board for the so-called Great Rejuvenation?
Well, like you said, Taiwan, I think, is a very, very difficult problem. it's a reunification or reunification if you're looking at it from Beijing's standpoint. Is a key part of Great Rejuvenation, and if the country is not whole, can it be said to be quote unquote rejuvenated or great? But the situation in Hong Kong is complicating things. Taiwan has never had a good opinion of the one country, two systems arrangement, and what is happening in Hong Kong is worsening views, towards this sort of arrangement. At this point, although the mainland has sort of kept up quite stern rhetoric, saying it won't rule out force, but it's dealing with a slowing economy, deteriorating ties with the U.S. And I think it's very, very unlikely that China will invade and risk, drawing the U.S. into a conflict in this part of the world. So my take is that I think anything could happen. There's still 30 years before the target of Great Rejuvenation, and I think a lot can happen at that time.
Vikram, on the economy, on China's economy, we hear all kinds of things, some slowdown, some job losses and so forth is hurting and all that. And yet also we have this huge display, the parade, the nationalism and so forth. What is the state of China's economy? What are you feeling out there?
Well, China's economy, I think, as Dawn mentioned, is slowing down. I mean, it's partly homemade. It's partly because there's been a massive sort of debt build-up in the corporate sectors. Like the overall debt is like 300% of GDP, and they've been trying to reduce that debt. So that means less lending, but that slowed down the economy. So then they pumped up lending again. And then you had the trade war come along, which has hit the export sector, hit the supply chains. So that's been a sort of a double whammy. It has slowed down. It probably will slow down. It's also going through a transition from investment-led growth to consumption-led growth, which also involves some adjustment in the economy. So that story will continue. So they're trying to prop it up by pumping up lending for the time being, but that might be creating more problems for the future. But Nirmal, I have a question for you. You mentioned the Pew Research report on countries' impressions of China, and you mentioned how Indonesia's impressions had really significantly deteriorated. What is the change in other countries' impressions? I mean, they're a mix of favorable, unfavorable now, but overall, has the impression of China gone down, or has the impression of China gone up overall over the last, 10 years? Overall,
it's gone down.
Okay.
Over the last 10 years, overall it's gone down, and it's gone down significantly, of course, in the US and Canada and Western Europe, and again in the Asia-Pacific countries that Pew surveyed. So overall it has gone down, and it's declining globally. On average, it's declining, with the exceptions again of some countries in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, for example, Russia. They have a positive impression of China, and as I said, Sub-Saharan Africa and some countries in Latin America like Brazil, still positive, but generally, globally, it's gone down. It's turned negative, rather.
Could you hazard a guess as to why you think it's gone down so widely across many countries?
Probably apprehension, and probably like something like you were referring to about the BRI, the sort of coercive capitalism model, the cheap loans and so on and so forth, which eventually end up with a debt burden for the countries. And countries are become more aware of it now. And the volume of noise generated by the U.S. administration on China, highlighting China's bad trade practices over the last number of years and so forth, that has sort of hit home to a lot of countries. And there is grudging appreciation for President Trump's tough stance against China in many parts of the world, except perhaps in those countries which are sort of happy recipients of China's largesse, right? So in some countries in Africa, for example. So I think there's generally more awareness of China's rising power and rising military strength, and there's general apprehension about it. So anyway, thank you very much, Vikram, Dawn, Danson. Thank you very much for being with us today. That was great. Good luck out there.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's a wrap for Asian Insider this week. Very interesting week. Definitely a moment for China. The October 1 celebration was quite spectacular. It was noticed all around the world. Here in the States, there was particular attention paid to the military might on display. Till next time, This is Nirmal Ghosh for Asian Insider.